The call in the night. The soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated Officer Jake Westwood's determined face as his patrol car cruised through the quiet streets. It was past midnight, the city of Brookhaven cloaked in a hushed calm that only seemed to deepen the weight of his thoughts. Tonight, like so many others, he was out answering calls. Minor disturbances, petty crimes, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet he couldn't shake the restless energy gnawing at his core. A sudden crackle from his radio broke the silence. Dispatch to Unit 34. Possible disturbance reported at Southwood Park. Caller reports suspicious activity near the playground. Over. Jake grabbed the receiver. Unit 34 responding. ETA 3 minutes. The idea of a suspicious activity at the playground in the dead of night sent a familiar prickle of unease down his spine. Southwood Park was no stranger to trouble after dark, a haven for teenagers sneaking out, vagrants looking for shelter, and sometimes worse. Jake increased his speed, the patrol car slicing through the emptiness of the streets as the flashing lights painted the trees in strobes of red and blue. When he arrived, the scene seemed deceptively peaceful. The playground swings swayed lightly in the night breeze, their rusty chains creaking faintly, the sound almost haunting in the stillness. Parking the car, Jake stepped out, the cool air brushing against his uniform. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path as he scanned the area. Police. He called out, his voice firm yet steady. Anyone here? There was no immediate response. But then, from beneath the slide, he caught movement, a small, trembling figure barely visible in the shadows. His hand instinctively rested on the holster of his gun as he took a cautious step forward, his other hand gripping the flashlight. He pointed the beam toward the source of the motion. "Hey there," he said, keeping his tone gentle, trying not to startle whoever, or whatever, was hiding. "You okay?" The light revealed a girl, no older than 7 or 8, curled into herself as if trying to disappear. Her clothes were dirty, her hair a mess of wild curls, and her face was streaked with tears that glistened in the harsh light. She winced and raised a hand to shield her eyes from the beam. Jake crouched down, turning the flashlight away to ease her discomfort. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm Officer Jake. What's your name?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Her small frame shivered, and Jake could see her bare toes poking out from sneakers far too big for her. Finally, she whispered, "Maya." "Maya," Jake repeated, smiling reassuringly. "That's a beautiful name. What are you doing out here, Maya? Are you alone?" Her big brown eyes flickered with fear and uncertainty, and she hesitated before nodding. Jake felt his chest tighten. "Where are your parents? Do they know you're here?" Maya shook her head, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know where my mom is," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. She didn't come back." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He'd encountered runaways and neglected children before, but there was something in Maya's voice, something raw and pleading, that made this feel different. He wanted to press for more details, but he could see she was already at her limit. "Okay," he said gently, reaching into his jacket to grab a blanket he kept for emergencies. He draped it around her shoulders, her small frame almost disappearing under the fabric. "We're going to figure this out together, all right. But first, let's get you somewhere warm." Maya hesitated, glancing at him warily. He could see the struggle in her eyes. Trust was not something that came easily to her, it seemed. After a moment, though, she gave the faintest of nods and allowed him to help her to her feet. Jake led her to the patrol car, opening the back door and helping her inside. She curled up on the seat, clutching the blanket tightly around her. He could see her stealing glances at him through the rearview mirror as he started the engine and radioed in. "Unit 34 to dispatch. Disturbance was unfounded. Returning to base. Over." It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Protocol dictated that he report Maya's situation immediately and involve Child Protective Services. But Jake had seen too many kids get lost in the cracks of the system, and something told him Maya deserved more than that. For now, he'd take her to the station, get her something to eat, and try to piece together her story. As the car moved through the quiet streets, Jake couldn't help but glance back at Maya every so often. She was so small, so fragile-looking, but her eyes held a depth of pain far beyond her years. He felt a protective instinct stirring within him, stronger than he'd ever felt on the job. "Do you like hot chocolate?" he asked, breaking the silence. Maya blinked, caught off guard by the question. After a moment, she nodded, the tiniest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Jake smiled back. "Good. Let's get you some when we get to the station." For now, the questions could wait. First, she needed to feel safe. Then, he'd find out where her mother was, and what had driven this little girl to spend her nights alone in a cold, empty playground. And as they drove through the darkened streets, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this call was about to change everything. Shadows of the past. The glow of the police station's fluorescent lights felt harsh and unwelcoming as Jake pulled into the lot. The clock on the dashboard read 1:43 a.m., but the station was far from empty. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, where Maya was huddled under the emergency blanket, her wide eyes darting nervously between him and the unfamiliar surroundings. He gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out of the car. "Wait here for a second," he said softly. "I'll be right back." She didn't respond, just gripped the blanket tighter, shrinking into the corner of the seat. Jake sighed and headed inside, where the night desk officer, Millie Carter, was sipping lukewarm coffee and scrolling through her tablet. Millie raised an eyebrow as Jake approached. "You're back early. Thought you had a call at Southwood." "I did," Jake replied, lowering his voice. "And I found something. A kid. 8 or 9, I think. Alone in the playground." Millie's eyebrows shot up. "Alone? This late? What's her story?" Jake shook his head. "Not much yet. Her name's Maya, and her mom's missing. She said her mom didn't come back after going to find work." Millie sighed, setting down her tablet. "Sounds like a CPS case. Want me to call them?" Jake hesitated. He'd already gone over the protocols in his head a dozen times on the drive back. Maya's case should absolutely go through Child Protective Services, but his gut told him this wasn't that simple. Something felt off about her situation. Something he needed to understand before handing her over to a system he didn't entirely trust. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let me talk to her first, see if I can figure out more about what happened." Millie frowned but didn't argue. "All right. You want to set her up in the interview room. I can grab her some snacks or something." Jake nodded. "Thanks, Millie. That'd help." As he walked back out to the patrol car, he caught a glimpse of Maya's small face pressed against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Her eyes followed him as he opened the door. "Hey," he said gently. "We're going inside for a bit, okay? My friend Millie's setting up a room for us. She's really nice, and she's getting snacks. You hungry?" Maya hesitated, her gaze darting away, but then she gave a small nod. Jake offered her his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were cold and fragile, and it made his protective instincts flare even stronger. Inside the station, Millie had already laid out a small spread of snacks on the table: juice boxes, granola bars, and a few packets of crackers. The sight seemed to put Maya at ease, and she slowly settled into one of the chairs. Jake pulled up a chair across from her, giving her space while trying to keep his presence reassuring. "Here," he said, sliding a juice box toward her. "Take your time." Maya unwrapped a granola bar with trembling hands, taking small bites as Jake watched. He waited until she seemed a little calmer before speaking again. "Maya," he began softly, "can you tell me more about your mom? What's her name?" Maya looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her name's Celia." "Celia Wright." Jake nodded. "That's a pretty name. Do you know where she was going to look for work?" Maya shook her head, the curls framing her face bouncing slightly. She just said She said she'd try wherever they'd take her. She didn't want me to come with her. She said it wasn't safe. Jake's chest tightened. Celia's words were clear enough. Whatever job she was pursuing, it wasn't something she felt comfortable exposing her daughter to. That alone spoke volumes about her desperation. How long has she been gone? Jake pressed gently. Maya counted on her fingers before holding up 4. 4 nights. Jake suppressed a curse. 4 nights. That was a long time for a little girl to fend for herself, especially in the middle of winter. He leaned forward, keeping his tone soft and steady. Maya, do you have any other family? Someone else your mom might have gone to for help? Maya shook her head again. It's just us, she murmured. Mom said we had to leave Grandma's house because it wasn't good there. Jake frowned, filing that detail away. It sounded like Celia had been trying to shield her daughter from something, possibly more than just financial struggles. Okay, he said after a moment. You're doing great, Maya. I know these questions are tough, but they're going to help me find your mom. Can you think of anything else that might help? Did she say anything about where she was going or who she was meeting? Maya hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. There was a man, she said finally. He came to the house a few times before we left. He scared Mommy. She told him we didn't have anything and that he should go away. Jake's stomach twisted. Do you remember his name? Or what he looked like? She bit her lip, thinking hard. He was tall and had a beard. I don't know his name, but he yelled a lot. Jake clenched his fists under the table, keeping his expression neutral for Maya's sake. Whoever this man was, it was clear he'd been a source of fear for Celia. Jake would need to dig into Celia Wright's background, employment records, family connections, anything that might give him a lead. But he couldn't do it alone. Maya, he said, forcing a smile, you've been really brave tonight. I'm going to do everything I can to find your mom. But first, you need to get some rest. You can stay here for now, and we'll make sure you're safe. Maya's eyes widened, and she shook her head fiercely. No, I don't want to stay here. What if Mommy comes back and can't find me? Jake's heart ached at the desperation in her voice. He knelt beside her chair, meeting her gaze. I promise I'll let your mom know where you are as soon as I find her. But you need a warm place to sleep tonight. Can you trust me on this? Maya stared at him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Okay, she whispered. Jake stood, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't leave her at the station all night. It would feel too impersonal. And the thought of her in a cold, unfamiliar CPS facility made his stomach churn. His apartment wasn't exactly kid-friendly, but for tonight, it would have to do. All right, he said, standing up and ruffling her curls gently. Let's get going. Millie shot him a questioning look as he signed Maya out of the station's care. You sure about this, Jake? No, he admitted with a faint smile. But it feels like the right thing to do. As he drove Maya to his apartment, the city lights passing in a blur, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than he'd anticipated. Whatever Celia Wright was running from, it was serious and dangerous, and now it was his responsibility to protect her daughter and uncover the truth. Maya dozed off in the passenger seat, her head lolling against the window, and Jake allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain. Maya's safety and finding her mother were now his top priorities. Whatever it took. Pieces of a puzzle. The faint glow of the sunrise crept through the cracks in the blinds of Jake's modest apartment. In the soft morning light, the living room looked surprisingly warm, with its mismatched furniture and stacks of books piled haphazardly on the shelves. Jake stirred from his spot on the couch, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him like a physical burden. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Across the room, Maya was curled up in a nest of blankets on the recliner, her small face peaceful in sleep. Jake watched her for a moment, marveling at how innocent she looked. so different from the frightened child he'd found under the playground slide. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. Stretching, Jake stood and made his way to the kitchen, trying to stay quiet as he brewed a pot of coffee. His mind was already racing, going over everything Maya had told him the night before. Celia Wright, a missing mother with no immediate family, had crossed paths with a tall man with a beard who frightened her. It wasn't much to go on, but Jake knew it was a start. He needed to dig deeper into Celia's life. As he sipped his coffee, Jake pulled out his laptop and began searching public records. Celia Wright's name brought up a handful of results: an address at a rundown apartment complex on the city's east side, a few minor traffic violations, and a recent eviction notice. The eviction stung. It confirmed that she and Maya had been struggling more than he'd initially realized. He also found an outdated job listing that showed she'd once worked as a waitress at a diner a few blocks from her apartment. No employment records after that. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The picture forming in his mind was troubling. A single mother barely scraping by, forced to move from one precarious situation to another. And then there was the man Maya had described. A possible threat, someone who had come into their lives uninvited. Who was he? And what did he want? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Maya stood in the doorway, her curls even messier than the night before, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. She looked small and vulnerable, her wide eyes scanning the room as if trying to remember where she was. "Good morning," Jake said, keeping his voice gentle. "Did you sleep okay?" Maya nodded shyly, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her voice quiet but tinged with hope. Jake set his mug down and walked over to her, kneeling to her level. "I'm working on it," he said honestly. "I've been looking for clues this morning, and I have a few ideas. But it might take some time." Maya nodded again, though her face fell slightly. "Okay." Jake hesitated before adding, "How about some breakfast? Do you like pancakes?" Her eyes lit up for a moment, and she gave him a small smile. "Yeah." "Great," he said, standing and heading to the kitchen. "I make pretty good pancakes, if I do say so myself." As he whipped up the batter, he kept an eye on Maya, who had settled on the couch with a curious gaze. She watched him quietly, her small hands fiddling with the hem of the blanket. He could tell she was still wary, still trying to decide if she could trust him. He couldn't blame her. It was a lot for a child to process. When breakfast was ready, Jake set a plate of pancakes in front of her, complete with a small drizzle of syrup and a pat of butter. Maya dug in hesitantly at first, but soon her hunger took over, and she ate with more enthusiasm. Jake couldn't help but smile as he joined her at the table, feeling a strange sense of normalcy in the quiet moments they shared. After breakfast, he knew it was time to take the next step. "Maya," he said, watching her carefully, "I need to check out the last place you and your mom were staying. Do you think you can show me where it is?" Maya looked up, her expression uncertain. "What if Mommy comes back and we're not there?" Jake leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "If she goes back, I'll make sure someone tells her where to find us. But if we go, we might find something that helps us bring her home faster. Does that sound okay?" Maya bit her lip, thinking it over, then nodded. "Okay." The ride to the east side of town was quiet. Jake tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking Maya about her favorite shows and what she liked to do at school, but her answers were brief. He didn't push her. She was clearly deep in thought, her little hands clutching the edges of the blanket she'd insisted on bringing along. When they pulled up to the address Jake had found in the records, it was clear why Celia had been struggling. The apartment complex was in bad shape, with peeling paint, cracked windows, and an overgrown courtyard littered with trash. Jake's jaw tightened as he parked the car. "Is this it?" he asked, turning to Maya. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the building. "We lived in 2B. Jake got out and helped her from the car, keeping her close as they approached the entrance. The front door was propped open with a brick, and the interior hallway smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes. Jake felt Maya press closer to him as they climbed the creaking stairs. Apartment 2B was locked, but Jake knocked firmly. "Police," he called out. "Anyone home?" There was no answer, but faint noises from the adjacent apartment caught his attention. He knocked on that door instead, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a wiry man in his 50s with a suspicious scowl. "What do you want?" the man asked, his gaze darting between Jake and Maya. "I'm Officer Jake Westwood," Jake said, flashing his badge. "I'm looking for Celia Wright. She used to live next door. Have you seen her recently?" The man snorted. "Celia? Yeah, she lived there until the landlord kicked her out last week. Haven't seen her since." "Did anyone come around looking for her before she left?" Jake pressed. "Maybe a tall guy with a beard." The man's scowl deepened. "Yeah, I remember him. Came by a couple times, banging on her door and yelling. She always told him to leave, but he wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Seemed real angry about something." Jake's stomach sank. "Do you know his name?" "Nope," the man said, crossing his arms. "But he drove a black pickup truck, old model with a busted taillight." Jake nodded, filing the detail away. "Thanks for your help." As they headed back to the car, Jake could feel Maya's anxiety growing. She clung to his hand, her eyes darting nervously around the parking lot. "Don't worry," he said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to figure this out." Back at the station, Jake ran a search for black pickup trucks registered in the area, cross-referencing it with known criminal records. It was a long shot, but luck was on his side. A name popped up that matched the description: Ron Bear Mitchell, a local enforcer known for working with loan sharks and shady characters. Jake's chest tightened. If Bear was involved, this wasn't just a case of financial trouble. It was something much more dangerous. And Celia was right in the middle of it. "All right, Maya," he said, glancing at her as she sat nearby, coloring in a notebook Millie had given her. "We've got a lead. Let's go." As they left the station, Jake couldn't shake the growing sense of urgency. Time was running out, and he had a sinking feeling that finding Celia was going to take him deeper into the shadows than he'd ever expected. But one look at Maya's hopeful face reminded him of why he couldn't stop now. He was all she had, and he wasn't about to let her down. Into the shadows. The air was heavy with tension as Jake's car cruised down a desolate stretch of road, heading toward the industrial district on the outskirts of Brookhaven. Maya sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket draped across her lap. Jake had debated long and hard about bringing her along, but the thought of leaving her behind, alone or in the sterile environment of the station, felt wrong. Besides, the lead he was chasing wasn't guaranteed to pay off. It was just another thread in a tangled web, and he couldn't afford to lose momentum. Ron Bear Mitchell. The name hung in Jake's mind like a dark cloud. Known for his brute strength and ties to loan sharks, Bear was exactly the kind of person Jake hoped Celia hadn't crossed paths with. But the evidence was mounting. The description, the black pickup, the anger, it all pointed to him. Jake's phone buzzed on the console. Keeping one hand on the wheel, he picked it up to see a text from Millie. Ran Bear Mitchell's file. Last known address: warehouse on 15th and Dyer. Be careful. This guy's bad news. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The warehouse district wasn't a place people went willingly. Abandoned factories and crumbling storage facilities had become havens for illicit activity. If Celia was being held, or worse, Jake needed to tread carefully. He glanced at Maya. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. He could tell she was trying to be brave, but the slight tremble in her hands gave her away. "You doing okay, Maya?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Are we going to find Mommy?" Jake forced a reassuring smile. "We're going to do everything we can, but I need you to stay close to me and follow my instructions, okay? No matter what happens." Maya nodded again, her expression solemn. Okay. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a hulking shadow against the gray sky. Jake parked a block away, keeping the car out of sight. He crouched by Maya's side before they got out, his voice low but firm. Maya, I need you to stay in the car. Lock the doors, and don't open them for anyone but me. If anything happens, honk the horn. Okay. She looked hesitant, but her wide eyes told him she understood. Okay. Jake squeezed her hand before stepping out, closing the door quietly behind him. The crunch of gravel under his boots seemed deafening in the eerie stillness as he approached the warehouse. He scanned the area, noting the scattered debris and rusted machinery that provided plenty of cover. His instincts were on high alert. Something about this place felt wrong. Peeking through a grime-covered window, Jake caught a glimpse of movement inside. A black pickup truck with a shattered taillight was parked near the loading dock. Two men stood nearby, their voices muffled but their body language tense. Jake couldn't make out what they were saying, but he recognized one of them immediately. Bear Mitchell, broad-shouldered, bearded, and radiating the kind of menace that made people cross the street to avoid him. Jake's heart pounded. He needed to know if Celia was inside, but going in alone was a gamble. He crouched behind a stack of crates, weighing his options. His mind raced through the possibilities. Call for backup and risk alerting Bear, or act now and risk getting in over his head. Suddenly, a muffled shout cut through the air, followed by the sound of a scuffle. Jake's stomach dropped. That voice, it had to be Celia. Without another thought, he moved toward the side entrance, his gun drawn. The door was slightly ajar, and he slipped inside, the musty air and faint scent of oil filling his lungs. The interior was dimly lit, the flicker of a single overhead bowl casting long, shifting shadows. Jake kept to the walls, his footsteps silent as he approached the source of the commotion. The voices grew louder. Just give us what we want, and we'll let you go, Bear growled, his tone dripping with menace. I told you, I don't have it. A woman's voice shot back, trembling but defiant. Jake's chest tightened. Celia. You're lying, Bear snapped. You had the box when you left. We know you've got it stashed somewhere. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Jake peeked around a corner and saw Celia tied to a chair, her face bruised but her eyes blazing with fury. Two other men stood nearby, watching Bear intimidate her. Jake's mind worked frantically, trying to come up with a plan. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Millie. At 15th and Dyer Warehouse. Need backup ASAP. Hostile suspects. Bear Mitchell involved. A woman's life is in danger. Then he slid the phone back into his pocket, his focus returning to the scene in front of him. He couldn't wait for backup, not with the way things were escalating. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped out of the shadows, his gun raised. Police, hands where I can see them. The room froze. Bear turned slowly, a sneer spreading across his face. Well. Look who decided to join the party. Let her go, Bear, Jake ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Bear chuckled, his posture relaxed, but his eyes cold and calculating. You've got guts, cop. I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered. Jake's gaze flicked to the two other men, who had their hands hovering near their waistbands. You don't want to do this, he warned. Reinforcements are on the way. This is your last chance to walk away. Bear's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. You think I'm scared of a couple of cops? You don't know who you're dealing with. Jake's eyes didn't leave Bear's, but his mind was racing. He needed to keep them talking, buy time until backup arrived. What's in the box, Bear? Jake asked, his tone calculated. What's so important that you're willing to risk everything for it? Bear's sneer deepened. Let's just say it's my insurance policy. Celia here thought she could outsmart me, but nobody takes from me and gets away with it. Jake's stomach twisted. Whatever was in that box, it was clearly the key to everything. and Bear wasn't going to give it up without a fight. Suddenly, the faint sound of sirens in the distance caught Jake's attention. His heart leaped. Backup was close. But Bear heard it too, and his expression darkened. "Looks like time's up," Bear growled. "Take him out." One of the men lunged, but Jake was ready. He ducked, disarming the attacker with a swift move before taking him down with a well-placed elbow to the gut. The second man pulled a knife, but Jake's training kicked in, and he deflected the attack, his gun aimed squarely at Bear. "Don't move," Jake barked, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The sirens grew louder, and within moments, the warehouse was flooded with officers. Bear and his men were quickly subdued, their weapons confiscated. Jake holstered his gun, his heart still pounding as he rushed Celia. "Celia," he said softly, untying her restraints. "Are you okay?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice shaky. "Thank you." As the officers secured the scene, Jake led Celia outside, where Maya was waiting in the car. The little girl's face lit up when she saw her mother, and she scrambled out, running to her. "Mommy," Maya cried, throwing her arms around Celia's waist. Celia knelt, holding her daughter tightly as tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Jake stood back, giving them a moment. His chest felt tight with emotion as he watched the reunion. He knew there were still questions to be answered, still pieces of the puzzle to fit together. But for now, they were safe. For now, they were together. And for Jake, that was enough. The weight of secrets. The atmosphere in the precinct was tense as Jake ushered Celia and Maya into one of the quieter meeting rooms. The chaos at the warehouse had been contained, and Bear Mitchell, along with his men, was now in custody. But Jake's mind was far from at ease. There were still too many unanswered questions, and the fragile trust he had built with Celia and Maya now carried the weight of knowing that their safety and justice hinged on what came next. Celia sat stiffly at the table, her arms protectively wrapped around Maya, who had fallen asleep in her lap. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of determination there too. A mother's resolve not to let her daughter down again. Jake placed 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table and sat across from her, his own cup untouched. He didn't want to push her too hard, but they were running out of time. Bear's men would lawyer up quickly, and any chance to leverage the evidence they had, if it even still existed, would slip away if Celia didn't start talking. "Celia," he said gently, leaning forward, "we need to talk about the box." She flinched at the mention of it, her fingers tightening around Maya's shoulders. "I don't have it anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got rid of it. I thought it would keep us safe." Jake's jaw tightened. What was in it? Bear called it his insurance policy. "He seems to think you still have it." Celia hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door as if she were considering bolting. Jake reached across the table, his voice soft but firm. "Celia, I can't protect you if I don't know what we're dealing with. Whatever's in that box, it's dangerous enough that Bear was willing to kill for it. Help me understand." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. Then, with a shaky breath, Celia began to speak. "It started 6 months ago," she said, her voice trembling. "I was working at this diner on the east side. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to get by. Then one night, Bear came in with some of his guys. They were loud, throwing money around like they owned the place. I tried to ignore them, but Bear, he noticed me." Her eyes dropped to the table, and Jake could see the shame written on her face. "He started coming back, always sitting in my section, always leaving big tips. At first, I thought he was just being generous, but then he started asking questions, personal questions, about my daughter, about where we lived. It scared me." Jake's fists clenched under the table, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "I tried to avoid him, but one night, He cornered me after my shift. He said he needed someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't ask questions. He offered me a lot of money to keep a special item for him. I didn't want to, but he made it clear that saying no wasn't an option. Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes. It was a small metal box. He said I couldn't open it, that I just had to keep it safe. He told me it would only be for a couple of weeks, but weeks turned into months, and the pressure kept building. He'd show up at my apartment, asking about it, making sure I hadn't done anything with it. Jake leaned forward, his voice low. "What was in the box, Celia?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I swear, I never opened it. But I overheard Bear talking to one of his men once. They mentioned ledgers and photos, something about people in high places. I think it was evidence, proof of corruption, maybe blackmail material." Jake's stomach turned. If that was true, the box wasn't just dangerous, it was explosive. Bear could have been using it to control powerful people, and if Celia had been holding it, she'd been caught in the crossfire of something far bigger than she realized. "What happened to the box?" Jake asked, his voice tight. Celia hesitated. "I panicked," she admitted. "After Maya and I got evicted, I couldn't keep it with me. I didn't know what to do, so I hid it. Somewhere I thought Bear would never find it." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Where?" "At the old library downtown," she said. "There's a storage room in the basement. I put it in an old locker and left it there." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "Does Bear know where it is?" Celia shook her head. "No. At least, I don't think he does. But he knew I was hiding something. That's why he came after me." Jake ran a hand through his hair. The library wasn't far, but retrieving the box wouldn't be easy, not with Bear's men still out there. He glanced at Celia and Maya, who had started to stir in her mother's arms. "All right," he said finally. "Here's the plan. I'll go to the library and get the box. In the meantime, you and Maya are staying here under protective custody. I'll make sure you're both safe." Celia looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "You do that? After everything?" Jake smiled faintly. "It's my job." The library was dark and silent when Jake arrived, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he navigated the narrow corridors. The building had been abandoned for years, its shelves empty and its windows covered in grime. Jake's footsteps echoed off the tile floors as he made his way to the basement. The air grew colder as he descended, and the faint scent of mildew tickled his nose. His heart pounded as he approached the storage room, his gun drawn. The door was unlocked, just as Celia had said, and inside, he found a row of rusty lockers. Jake checked each one methodically until he found it. A small silver box, its surface tarnished but intact. He picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing over the latch. For a moment, he was tempted to open it, to see what was inside. But he resisted. This wasn't his call to make. As he turned to leave, a faint noise caught his attention. The creak of footsteps above. His blood ran cold. Someone was here. Jake moved quickly but silently, keeping to the shadows as he made his way back to the stairs. His grip on the box tightened as he peeked around the corner. Two figures were silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the front doors. They weren't officers. Bear's men. Jake's heart raced as he weighed his options. He could try to sneak past them, but if they caught sight of him, it would turn into a fight. And he couldn't risk losing the box. Instead, he reached for his radio, keeping his voice low. "This is Officer Westwood," he whispered. "I've got the evidence and 2 hostiles at the downtown library, requesting immediate backup." As the faint sound of sirens began to build in the distance, Jake steadied himself, his focus razor-sharp. He'd come this far. There was no turning back now. Whatever secrets the box held, they were worth fighting for. He just had to make it out alive. A new dawn. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the empty library, growing louder with each passing second. Jake pressed himself against the cold brick wall of the stairwell, clutching the small silver box in one hand and his gun in the other. The two men prowling the ground floor weren't amateurs. Their movements were calculated, deliberate. Bear Mitchell's enforcers were clearly hunting for him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they decided to search the basement. The seconds dragged on, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Jake's mind raced. The box in his hand felt heavier than it should, its weight a stark reminder of the danger it represented. Whatever secrets it held had put Celia and Maya in harm's way, and now it was his responsibility to see this through. A sudden creak of the stairs snapped Jake's attention upward. One of the men was descending, his heavy boots thudding softly against the concrete. Jake took a deep breath, gripping his gun tighter. He could hear the man muttering into a walkie-talkie, his voice low but urgent. "We've got movement in the basement. I think he's down here." Jake's pulse quickened. He knew he had only seconds to act. Keeping his steps silent, he moved further into the shadows, positioning himself near a stack of old shelves for cover. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could see the man's silhouette in the dim light. When the figure passed, Jake sprang into action, sweeping the man's leg out from under him and sending him sprawling to the floor. Before he could cry out, Jake had his knee on the man's chest and his gun pressed to his temple. "Don't move," Jake hissed, his voice deadly calm. The man froze, his hands raised in surrender. Jake quickly disarmed him, tossing the weapon across the room. "Where's your partner?" Jake demanded, his eyes locked on the man's terrified face. The man hesitated, but the cold press of Jake's gun against his temple convinced him to speak. "Upstairs," he stammered. "He's by the entrance, watching for cops." Jake glanced toward the stairwell, his mind racing. The sirens were close now. Backup would arrive any minute. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Stay down," Jake ordered, pressing the man's radio button and speaking into it. "False alarm. No one's here." He released the button before the man could respond, then swiftly tied his hands with a set of zip ties from his belt. "Don't make a sound," Jake warned before slipping back into the shadows. The second enforcer was exactly where the first had said, standing near the entrance, his back to the stairwell. Jake moved silently, using the creaking floorboards and faint echoes to mask his approach. Just as he reached the top of the stairs, the sound of screeching tires announced the arrival of the police. The enforcer turned toward the noise, and Jake used the distraction to his advantage. He rushed forward, tackling the man and pinning him to the ground. The fight was brief. Jake was well trained, and the element of surprise was on his side. Within moments, the second man was restrained, and the silver box was still secure in Jake's grip. By the time he stepped out of the library, the flashing lights of patrol cars and the commanding presence of officers filled the scene. Jake handed off the restrained enforcers to his colleagues, then made his way to the officer in charge. "Detective Alvarez," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is the evidence Bear Mitchell's been after. Whatever's in here is key to his operation." Alvarez, a seasoned detective with a sharp eye, studied Jake for a moment before taking the box. "Good work, Westwood. I'll get this to the lab. You've done enough." Jake nodded, relief washing over him as the weight of the box left his hands. But his work wasn't over yet. There was still Celia and Maya to consider. Back at the precinct, Celia was pacing the small meeting room, her face etched with worry. Maya sat on a chair nearby, clutching her mother's hand tightly. When Jake walked in, both of them froze, their eyes locking onto his. "Did you get it?" Celia asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded. "It's safe. Bear's men are in custody, and the evidence is being processed. Whatever he was planning, it's over." Celia let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling Maya into a tight hug. Jake sat across from them, his tone gentle but firm. "Celia, I need you to tell the truth about everything. The evidence in that box will help take Bear down, but your testimony will make the case ironclad. It's the only way to ensure he never comes after you or Maya again." Celia hesitated, her hand tightening on Maya's shoulder. "What if he has people on the outside? What if they come after us?" Jake leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I won't let that happen. We'll make sure you're protected. But we need your help." For a long moment, Celia said nothing. Then she nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "All right. I'll do it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, debriefings, and strategic planning. Celia's testimony, combined with the contents of the silver box, was damning. It implicated not only Bear Mitchell, but several high-profile figures in a web of corruption and crime. The fallout was massive, shaking the city to its core. Through it all, Jake remained by Celia and Maya's side, ensuring their safety and supporting them as they adjusted to their new reality. The department arranged for them to move into a safe house under police protection, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of Bear's influence. One evening, as Jake visited them at their new home, Maya ran up to him, her face beaming. "Officer Jake, look, Mommy got me a new teddy bear." Jake smiled, crouching to her level. "That's great, Maya. What's his name?" "Jake," she said proudly, holding up the stuffed bear. "Because you're my hero." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat as he ruffled her curls. "You're the real hero, kiddo." Celia stood in the doorway, watching the exchange with a soft smile. "You've done more for us than I could ever repay," she said quietly. Jake straightened, meeting her gaze. "You don't owe me anything, Celia. Just take care of Maya. That's all the thanks I need." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm golden glow, Jake felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was confident they'd find their way, together. A new beginning. Jake stayed for dinner that evening, the small kitchen filled with the warm, homey scents of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. The safe house was modest but cozy, a far cry from the precarious conditions Celia and Maya had endured. Laughter echoed in the tiny dining area as Maya told stories about her favorite cartoons, her face animated with joy. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to relax. The last few weeks had been grueling, filled with uncertainty and danger. But seeing Maya smile so freely, and watching Celia begin to regain her confidence, made it all worthwhile. After dinner, Jake helped clear the table while Maya curled up on the couch with her new teddy bear. Celia joined him in the kitchen, drying dishes as he washed. "You're good with her," Celia said after a long silence, her voice soft but sincere. Jake glanced over, surprised by the sudden comment. "She's a great kid," he replied, shrugging. "She's been through a lot, but she's tough. Like her mom." Celia's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at the plate in her hands. "You've been our rock through all of this, Jake. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Jake set down the dish he was washing and turned to face her. "Celia, you don't owe me anything. What I did, what I'm doing, isn't about repayment. It's about doing what's right. For you, for Maya, for everyone Bear and his people hurt." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of her gratitude was palpable. "Still," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "thank you. For everything." Jake gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me, Celia. Just focus on building the life you and Maya deserve." As the weeks turned into months, the case against Bear Mitchell gained momentum. Celia's testimony and the damning evidence from the silver box proved to be a fatal blow to his operation. High-profile arrests followed, sending shockwaves through the city's underworld. With Bear locked away and his influence crumbling, Celia and Maya began to find a sense of normalcy. Jake visited them often, becoming a regular fixture in their lives. At first, he told himself it was just part of his duty, to make sure they were safe. But as time went on, he realized it was more than that. He cared about them deeply, in a way that went beyond professional obligation. One crisp autumn evening, Jake found himself sitting on the porch of their safe house, watching Maya chase a butterfly across the yard. Celia joined him, holding 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. "She's happier than I've seen her in years," Celia said, handing him a mug and sitting beside him. "And that's because of you." Jake took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. "It's because of both of you," he said. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Celia. You've been through hell, and you came out the other side." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it alone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was filled with the soft rustling of leaves, and Maya's delighted giggles as she twirled in the yard. Jake felt a strange, comforting peace settle over him. "Jake," Celia said finally, her voice hesitant, "I don't know where this road is leading, but I'd like you to be a part of it. For me and for Maya." Jake turned to her, surprised but deeply moved. "Celia, I—" Before he could finish, Maya ran up to them, her face flushed with excitement. "Look, Mommy, I caught the butterfly." Celia laughed, reaching out to examine the delicate creature perched on Maya's finger. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Jake watched the scene unfold, a warmth spreading through his chest. He realized then that he didn't need to respond with words. His actions, his presence, had already said everything he couldn't find the courage to express. Months later, as the first snow of winter dusted the ground, Jake stood in the doorway of a new house, a house they had chosen together. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, a fresh start in a safe neighborhood with a small yard where Maya could play. Jake carried a box labeled Maya's Toys into the living room, where Celia was unpacking kitchen supplies. Maya danced around the room, singing to herself as she arranged her stuffed animals on a shelf. "This feels like home," Celia said softly, glancing at Jake as he set the box down. "It is home," he replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. She smiled, stepping closer to him. "Thank you for being here. For staying." Jake looked at her, the weight of the past months fading as he saw the hope in her eyes. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." And as Maya tugged at their hands, pulling them toward the Christmas tree she'd insisted on decorating herself, Jake realized he'd found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a family. Not one defined by blood, but by choice and love. For Jake, Celia, and Maya, the road ahead was still uncertain, but they faced it together, with open hearts and the unshakable belief that they could build a brighter future. Together, they had found their new beginning.